When have you had to publicly support something that you didn't privately align with? How often do you ask yourself, am I spending my life on the right things? Hi, I'm Becky Burley, co founder of What Drives Winning with Brett Ledbetter. On this episode of What Drives Winning Conversations, we explore those questions and more with SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey. Brett started with Greg's early days in compliance and trying to help regulate the SEC. Let's jump in.
You worked and were conditioned and socialized in the SEC in compliance. What do you think the best lesson you learned from that was?
I remember the thought, I still have notes from my evaluation about you take this job, eventually you're going to get mud splashed on you based on where you work. And what I mean by that is people are going to start to question your integrity based on being in that role. And yeah, it probably took a little bit of time for it to be a visible way. You can go back just very candidly to Cam Newton's experience, which was 2010 season. And I had a call on a Monday morning about the New York Times publishing an article in early November about cover-ups and, hiding things, which was like, light years from the truth of what had happened. But that was a particularly tough moment, and it kind of validated what I thought when I stepped into the role. I think that's the essence of you're going to be in roles working to do the right thing, and especially now with social media, you're going to be questioned from an integrity, ethical standpoint. People are going to make accusations. Like there was a missed face mask in a NFL game last night. So if you go on social media, it becomes about, oh yeah, the fix was in from a gambling perspective. No, people miss things in the mall.
When your character is being attacked, what's the best lesson you've learned from being misunderstood?
There's not one. So there's one that's like the current label is self-care. You need to step away. So we had a tough 5 minutes in Austin, Texas on Saturday night, and I have responsibility for that. We didn't do it. I didn't do it. It's done by 8 people applying judgment in front of 100,000, which very few people ever have to do in life, by the way. So they don't understand, I think, the psychological and interpersonal dynamics. And so the first one was find a little bit a breathing room so you can kind of reset from the intensity of that moment. Those days go to like 2 a.m. Sunday morning, and then they start again at 6 a.m. Not that they ever really stop because there's not a lot of rest. And then you're back in it. And if you don't find an opportunity to step away, you just allow yourself to get into that cycle, and then you get tired. And when you're tired, you make bad decisions, and you have the kind of thoughts that aren't productive or counterproductive. So that's one. And the second is to communicate, but also to draw a line. So I had to draw some lines with some people for whom I have great respect, that we're just not going to play the text message game. And I typically challenge people, and did right away with, I'm fine with communication, but one individual involved, I said, I called you 2 times a week and a half ago and you reached out. You did not follow up after telling me you wanted to talk. It's a lot better to talk. Then when we did talk on Tuesday rather than Sunday, it was pretty productive. And it included, I'd much rather have a conversation than respond to text messages. And the excuse given was, well, if you've got my schedule, you don't have time. And the pushback was, well, if you have my schedule, you don't have time to make time. So I'd start on those 2 issues. One, yourself. Second, communication. But you need to draw lines, because I don't have any satisfactory answers for those 5 minutes. I just have to deal with what happened.
How do you find the discipline? Because it seems like the time we need to take a step back the most is when we're being pressed the hardest. How have you found the discipline to manage that moment?
Practice is one. I alluded to my earlier career moments, and I was able to deal with issues off Broadway, and now it's all headlines all the time. And somebody asked me once, what was the difference between my old job and my new job? And I said, I never had a phone conversation in the Southland Conference that I was at dinner in a restaurant watching ESPN with no sound, right? And watching something that I talked about at 10 a.m. scrolling at 5 p.m. Although 5 p.m. is a little early for dinner. That's like the senior discount moment, which I've moved into. So it'd be like 7 p.m. And so I was able to be in those moments without the kind of scrutiny I deal with now. So that's one. The second is you probably, you understand there's going to be criticism. You're doing the best you can, and you're going to have to make the best judgments. And I'll give you an example, and it relates to the NFL. So two wrongs don't make a right is a nice cliche, but we had a bad penalty call and then a bad change of the penalty call. So two wrongs don't make a right, even though I think everyone said it was the right outcome. It was the wrong process. Both quarterbacks in the game threw interceptions. There was a change made by Texas. Georgia never made a change. So I had a bad moment for an official who's worked with us for 3 years, who's on the NFL watch list. Do I publicly suspend that individual because people demand accountability? And really what they demand is public accountability that somehow satisfies their emotions, not accountability, because accountability is applied in 50 different ways, and we do that. But we don't have to advertise it, because we know when you advertise accountability, it lives, and it lives continually. And I have a set of officials still working with us who officiated an Arkansas game in Gainesville back in 2008. Tebow was playing, roughing the passer call that wasn't there. And there are reasons. Like you always be careful about what you say in training tapes for officials. I don't do those because they react. So if you say, hey, we have to watch for fill in the blank, the next week you will have more fill in the blank calls. And so in that particular week in 2008, 16 years ago, the coordinator of officials for the Southeastern Conference said, we have to be more attentive to roughing the passer. And lo and behold, what did we get? More roughing the passer calls. Now that may have been right, but the calls also have to be right. It's not just quantity, it's the quality of the call. Well, in this circumstance, it was phantom. And so my predecessor announced a suspension of the entire officiating crew. So the white hat, the referee, every time you do an Arkansas game, or if there was a controversial call online, he would be the subject of criticism for something that happened in 2008. We've actually moved that individual out of the referee position. He's still on a crew, and you know what? There's no more noise. Other members of that crew have been dispersed. And I remember vividly, there was a Florida game at South Carolina where a screen pass, so behind the line of scrimmage, you can block downfield when that pass is made. It's not offensive pass interference. There was a delay by the quarterback. The pass is downfield yard. Should have been offensive pass interference. We moved it. There are two members of that crew that was suspended on that Florida South Carolina crew. Neither of them had responsibility for either call. Yet our fans go and find that while they worked the game in Gainesville in 2008, the game in Columbia in 2017, why are they still working as officials? It has nothing to do with accountability. It has nothing to do with improvement. It's just kind of a reaction at a superficial level. So you have to be able to withstand those moments. Back to your, how do you guide yourself and think about, hey, I need to help that official improve. And if in this case he can't improve, then we're not going to have that official long term. Just like a quarterback who throws 2 interceptions in the first quarter, I need to help that individual improve if I'm a coach and withstand the criticism that we need to go to the backup. Right?
Hey, if you were going to teach that with increased visibility comes a split audience, how would you do that?
I think split just implies 2 audiences, and I would offer there's more than 2, but the split I'll take is kind of the public demand and the personal decision making, right? And then there are subsets. You're going to have to figure out priorities and decision making. And then you're going to have to figure out how much the external pressure is going to influence your decision making. And the second's a lot easier to observe when you're not in the chair. And then when you're in the chair, it's a big deal. And so I had been in the SEC office for 13 years before I became commissioner. Now I'll give you a real direct example. There was a shooting in Charleston, South Carolina on a Wednesday night in the church, my second week in this role. And my predecessor and the commissioner before him had said things about displays of the Confederate battle flag at the state level. And I thought they made a very clear statement. But then you're in the middle of that, and we needed to lead some change in South Carolina and Mississippi. South Carolina was front and center because of the location of the shooting in the church in Charleston. And so you make decisions about, hey, I'm going to make a stand because this is part of who we are and our DNA. It's about respect for people. Now, fast forward, in my office in Birmingham, Alabama, after I made the public statement, it was the local gun and knife show. The number of Confederate battle flags walking out of there with shotguns was pretty remarkable in front of my office window the next weekend. And there wasn't anything threatening, but you'd be amazed at the letters that I received, positive and negative. So the issue was, if you're playing to the audience, in that one, there's a personal decision making, and I'm not the person. We have to bring people into that decision in the conference, so the key presidents and chancellors. So a couple of subsets of the constituency that are more private. And then there's the public reaction. And you know that there's going to be individuals who oppose that. There's going to be individuals who support it. And so what's the personal clarity and what's the organizational clarity that needed to be brought to that decision? And that played out during the summer of 20. So 5 years later, around the state of Mississippi flag, which, it didn't change in 15, but it did change, in 2021. You have to accept in those moments, I can't do everything, but I can do this, right? So I can't change every piece of the kind of historical representations or the divisions or the respect for people, which is the fundamental piece to me there. But I could do that. And then I get letters that there's a Confederate flag over some county building and, name your state. I'm like, okay, I can't do that, but I could do what I did. And you have to accept that. And that's a little bit hard for the public to understand when you're thinking about the splits that you asked about initially.
And if you think about just the other side of that, when have you had to, just in your career, had to publicly support something that you didn't privately align with? And how did you navigate that moment?
Oh, there's a bunch of those. I'm living it now with the kind of money flowing through collectives and in the value reshaping that I think it creates for young people. But that's a hard one for me right now. The academic framework, and again, I think it was in the video, I don't think we understand yet what's going on. And so I look at that and say, okay, I accept the economic benefit. It's unregulated, uncontrolled. That's a problem. It creates a different set of values. And we're already challenged with the performance-based values. But I have a responsibility to keep trying to reset this and get it right. And I think long-term, the educational and personal impacts that we're creating now are not understood. And I would like to try to work through these issues to the extent it's possible. And so that's my reconciliation. It conflicts with my values, the Lamborghini displays versus the bigger picture of how do you help someone move from adolescence to adulthood on a college campus. Sports cars don't typically do that.
Well, hey, I want to ask you about that because, like, you look at Tony Bennett and there's others, right? And I don't think that it's the transactional environment that's pushing them out. I think it's that their word is the most important thing. And because things change so much, they're afraid that they can't maintain the accuracy of their word, and they're at a point in their career where it's just not worth it. How do you process that?
I said up front when California and then Florida passed these laws, and you could see the frustration mounting on the part of coaches and leaders, that we're going to lose good people from this endeavor, and that should be at the top of our concern list. Now, I can't speak to the how and why Tony came to his decision. I don't know him. I've not met him. I have spoken with some of our coaches who said, you know what, it's time, and I'll protect their confidences because there is some of the change. Now, they're responsible for the environment in which they find themselves, including Tony. That has to be acknowledged, and I have that responsibility too. And that's why when you ask me,
Why do you think that's hard for them to acknowledge?
This is an echo chamber. It's like college athletics, and we look at it in the moment and say our motives are pure. We're just trying to help young people, or hey, we got them paid and then we lost control. And I think that the transactional piece you spoke of began with the transfer movement. Forget the money. That I think you and I may have had conversations about coaches needing to be much more focused on the relational aspect of their work. And from the video, note that there is a transactional component. There is a performance-based expectation, but I think different in college from the professional level. The professional level is all performance-based. I can cut you on Monday in the NFL. I'll have somebody else Monday afternoon. I was watching the Falcons. There's a guy that played at Alabama, just because I read the article is how I can recall that, Rashaan Evans. So he was on the Falcons the first 4 weeks of the season, and then he was cut for 2 weeks. Now he's back. Well, that's just performance-based because somebody didn't perform at the same level. It's like my official. I have to have, if I get rid of an official, I have to have somebody step in that can perform at that level or better. And there are not a lot of people out there that can do that. In college, you don't have that option. So it has to be, that there's performance-based, but it has to be relational. And I think some of the coaches who didn't adjust back in 18, 19, 20, are either not in it or have struggled in a different way. And now they're tricked into thinking, well, this is just a money-based deal, which just multiplies the problem. So, Brett, I don't know that I'm answering what you asked me, but those are the realities that I observe.
A while ago.
Look at the young me. Where are my glasses in that one?
I want you to watch this, and then I'm going to ask you about this, okay? This is about 9 years ago.
What percent of the things that hit your desk land in the gray area of no clear-cut answer?
70 to 80%, I think. Someone from the outside looking in may say, well, that's easy. When you're in the chair, when you're in the leader's chair, I learned this a long time ago when I was in an off-Broadway role leading an athletic conference. It's nice to be an advisor because I can say, here's what I think. But the person in the leader's chair has to think and then decide. And the reality is, there are defined circumstances, and those are easy. But I could list a multitude of issues where it may seem obvious, yet a set of underlying circumstances make the decision significantly more complex.
So my question to you is, how would you advise someone that's in the gray area to create a concrete value system to navigate that?
So first of all, I wore a suit and tie for that interview, so I'm much more secure in my outfits, apparently, or want to be comfortable on a Friday. Second of all, I used off-Broadway, right, in that interview, and I used it today, so I'm consistent. Third, I'd elevate 70 to 80% to 90 to 95% in the gray area. Not ethically gray, just you have to make judgments, and COVID altered that. Fourth, I had a staff member who's now moved into she worked with me for 20 plus years and then moved into a new role on a campus outside of league, come to me after that and ask me the same question. And that's where I elevated the 90, 95%. So I've been pretty consistent. My numbers are a little bit off. I went through a personal moment, and there are two components back in the mid '90s. So I passed out on a bathroom floor. I think I probably told you that story, and my heart freaked out for a moment with an atrial fibrillation. And this is in the off Broadway time, and I'd been in that role as a leader for a year. I was drinking 3 lattes a day. I wasn't exercising much. I wasn't sleeping well, which all of that happened still, but I wasn't managing myself well. And so I went, and it took me like 3 or 4 years to develop a set of principles. And I've shown you the card, Brett and Becky, that we're going to be at least guideposts for my life. And it's a little bit deeper than that. So that's one. And what I would encourage everybody is don't, like, if you're waking up on a bathroom floor like I did near gate A26 in the Atlanta airport, right beside a urinal is where it happened. As a principle in life, if you're getting up off the bathroom floor for whatever reason, you're not in a healthy place. And sometimes you get up off the bathroom floor in a college town for different reasons, on a Thursday night, Thirsty Thursday product. But for me, it was not being able to manage myself. And that informed a set of principles. So that's one aspect of it. And then the second, and those things have to build other thoughts and principles. See, it's not just static. I think the building blocks are static. And then how do I develop and think about these problems? Like, if you told me 20 years ago I'd be dealing with what I am in a leadership role, I'd say, well, I'm going to go do something else. I'll be a Division III athletic director. But you heard, while I have this stress around values, I do think I have a responsibility, as hard as it is, to try to help. And if I can't help, then I'll be the first to acknowledge that. The second component is you have to go through an evaluation. And I just had a mentoring video conference with somebody yesterday where they were very goal-setting, goal-oriented up front. And I said, here's an example. I want to read 20 books during my summertime from like mid-May till Labor Day. So that's kind of a mental goal I've set. If you set that as a hard goal, and you can take anything else in your career, if I set that as a hard goal, I would never read, for example, an 800-page book. But last summer, I had been encouraged by 3 different Army generals, all West Point grads, to read the book Once an Eagle. They said it's a great leadership novel. Well, it's 800 pages. Well, that's in direct conflict with reading 20 books. And so
That counts for 8 for me, man.
Yeah, but I read the book and I still exceeded my goal of 20. And so you have to go through evaluations of the big picture, right? And so for me, that's now in June. I'll take a step back and think through those principles that I came up with in late 90s, early 2000s, how they fit now. Where am I exceeding my own expectations? Where am I meeting those? And where am I falling short? And the last part is, in a career moment, you have to define what's doable hard versus destructive hard. And there are those are two differences. So you want roles that are doable hard. You want to wake up and have your heart beat a little faster because you have an opportunity to lead and shape change. But when that's doable hard. When you go through destructive hard, and I learned this from somebody else and I developed the thinking on my own, it's like living with COVID for a year. Like, I could do that for a defined period of time, even though I couldn't understand the period of time. But if we were like in 5 years of COVID, I'd be, out fishing in a lake someplace, even though I don't fish. But that was a better option than going through that. So you can do it. And Becky lived this, you could do it for a period of time, and it had its momentary frustrations, but you can't do that forever. And I think that's what you're seeing with the Tony Bennett, most likely, is it became destructive for who he thinks he is and who he wants to be, and informing the why he does it.
Hey, I want to show you one more video from the past, and I just want your immediate reaction to this. I ask you, what is your biggest conflict?
Am I spending my life on the right things?
How do you process that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think about that at least once a week. I'm in the Austin airport Sunday morning, filled with Georgia fans, and they come up to me and like, oh no, here we go. It's all about pass interference. And they were all really kind one-on-one. And they're like, hey, you're doing a great job. Hey, thanks for your work. You've made us better. But is that sufficient? You know, in the scope of life and my responsibility and my faith and my dedication, is that enough? You know, what my wife told me, she's traveled to Rwanda. We've done some community center building to help through some churches there. We've invested in a family and learned that the mother involved died and has 2 kids, you know, that are young in Rwanda. So what do you do? And in the scope of that conversation, you know, whether it was pass interference, offensive or defensive, seems pretty small. So that informs how I think about things. And that's a much weightier issue than whether an official gets publicly suspended or not.
Hey, 2 questions on that. Like when you're in the airport and you see people recognize you, what's your first thought? Is it like, man, I got to deal with this? Let me pretend I'm on the phone. That was Billy Donovan's deal. Is he would walk around with his AirPods and then he'd just start talking, even though he's listening to music, so people would think he's on the phone.
Herb Vincent, who is our associate commissioner for communications, like the first month I was commissioner, he said, always remember they have a decision to make, and that decision is whether they like you or not. And he was talking about the media, but I think that's true in personal interaction. So I'm not looking to engage, but I'm never going to decline it. People will ask to take photos with me, which is one of those strange things I never expected. And I will always, as long as I'm not in a hurry, I'll ask them their name. And like in football media days, which is 4 days of nonstop for me, I had one guy chasing me down. I had to be at a radio interview. He just wanted a picture. And I said, I have to go to the radio interview. And I was really direct. And I blew it in that moment. And you know who was great was Bart Starr. So I'd spent a weekend with Bart Starr at our championship game. People would ask for autographs, and he had limitations on what he could do because he'd given some of those rights. But an individual autograph, he would always sign. So I was on a schedule with him, and I moved him into a ballroom, and there was a middle-aged woman who wanted his autograph. I don't know for what reason. And I said, well, we have to go. We got in the ballroom. He was very kind to me. He said, I feel badly. Would you go find her and bring her in here so I could sign that autograph? That was a really, really good lesson, which is they get to decide their impression and how can you inform the impression. The second piece is I have a general, a 4-star general who just retired that I've come to know through a mutual friend. So he's become a friend. And I was sent photos of him walking through Mosul in Iraq when he was a commanding officer. No flak jacket, a bunch of people around him. And my buddy who sent it to me, it's a mutual friend. They were both tank lieutenants way back in the day. So what do you notice about him? And I said, doesn't look like he has a flak jacket on. I said, no, put that aside. What do you notice? And there were like 8 pictures. In every one of those photos, he was smiling. So he was at that point a 2-star general in command in a life-threatening situation, leading a division with a smile on his face. And that's a pretty good lesson, you know, is even in those moments. So in the airport, people come up to me and I try to smile, even though I don't give that away much somehow, and have a conversation because they get to decide whether they like me or not. And I'd rather have them say, you know what, even though I don't like that call, he was a human being to me and he was respectful in the conversation. And that may not go anyplace. It may be on social media. It may be at the Waffle House on Monday morning. I don't know, but that's how I take the approach.
Well, ironically, the question I was going to ask was, when is the last time you felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over you?
If you saw the scene in front of me right now, every time I look up, I'm looking at a lake and a hillside full of autumn leaves in the northeast. When I go to football games in the first quarter around kickoff, I'll go to an end zone and try to be by myself for 10 minutes. And I actually take more joy from that than anything else in my week. And usually if I can be at an early game, because nothing's gone haywire at that point, just to be away and all of the things around name, image, and likeness and transfer portal and feigning injuries,
if I could read a transcript.
Don't exist. Yeah.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. If I could read a transcript of your thoughts when you're standing there alone by the end zone, what would I see?
You would see like, wow, I'm I'm like in this role, in this setting, and look at what's in front of me. That's one. The second is that guy didn't get blocked, and that quarterback's about to get, oh, wow, fumble. And there's 12 guys trying to grab it and run for a touchdown, and I'm standing right there. And then watching from the quarterback's perspective, because it was pretty close. I was in the end zone, and it's tight in Austin, and trying to see what he sees, and then wondering how he's processing, and wondering, like, you watch the intricacies of line play, which I don't fully understand. And I'm certain there's people on this video conference who understand better than me. Just watch it kind of play out. Then the impact and the speed, and then how do you officiate when you have 6 assignments at the same time? And we have to make it easier for the officials to officiate. That'll be like down the list, but it pops up in those moments. And then just kind of an appreciation back to the bigger picture. So those kind of boil it down, but just kind of the moment in the nature of what's been built in a positive way.
That environment is so electric that how can you discern the feelings to where there's like this synthetic almost drug that can course through your veins and take you into that versus you standing alone, recognizing the moment for what it is, and it's more of a soul feeling?
There are a couple things, and it's along the way there. I was at a football game in Baton Rouge. Alabama played LSU. It was a CBS game in 2009. Alabama went on to beat Texas for the national championship that year. End of regulation, Alabama's kicking a field goal to win it. Tie game, it's blocked, and the place just erupts. And in that moment, as I was watching the coaches and the players and the officials, and I was an associate commissioner, Becky knew me, but almost nobody else, I realized it takes something special to be in that environment and perform. You don't just take, I've talked about officials, but coaches and players too. You don't just take someone from like the high school football field and put them in that setting and they can perform, because it's such a different dynamic. And so what happens is you build the ability, in my experience, to focus on what's there. And yep, it's all that, it's spectacle, it's this, but then the ability to bring people along a continuum of growth, whether it's while they're a player or a participant, as a coach or as an official or as a conference commissioner, is, a repetition. It's just like practice that makes you better. And a confession here that I'll ask nobody to tweet. There's a few times in the last decade of this role that I've been totally freaked out. The first one I remember vividly was Alabama at Texas A&M. They rebuilt Kyle Field. It seats 108,000 people. I've flown in on a private plane a couple hours before the game. There were so many private planes at the airport. They parked me like way out, and I had to take a shuttle bus in and buy all these airplanes, which is hundreds of millions of dollars of aircraft. We drive in a police car. I walk in. I can still remember walking into the corner of the stadium, and you're like, what in the world am I doing in this role? I was born in Auburn, New York. My undergrad's from Portland State. I was an intramural director. What in the world am I doing in this role? There's 108,000 people, 2 nationally ranked teams. And from that moment, I started to just break it down into its smallest parts, right? And so somebody would say hello to me in the stands. I'd take a moment to wave and say hello. I generally avoid a lot of eye contact at games. It's a little too emotional. But, break it down into its smallest parts. It's this week. So last week, I had a problem. I got to deal with this week. I go to a game. I'm at that game. There's a lot of people who care, but my constituent base is right there in front of me. That's the way that I've tried to deal with the spectacle.
As always, my challenge for you is, what's your biggest takeaway from that conversation? When I asked the class that question, the most common response was doable hard versus destructive hard, and trying to find the line so that they don't pass out on the bathroom floor. We always want to leave you with a few questions to think about. These questions, as well as a link to download the listening guide, can be found in the description of this episode. In case you're active while you're listening currently, I'll read them out for you, and feel free to pause after each one to give yourself time to think about each answer. Question 1. When has your integrity been questioned the most? What did you learn from that experience? Question 2. When have you been around someone that cared more about what the external perception was as opposed to the internal reality? Question 3. When have you had to publicly support something that you didn't privately align with? How did you make peace with that inner conflict? Question 4. There's doable hard and there's destructive hard. How do you know when you've crossed that line? What example comes to mind from your own life? Question 5. Greg said that his biggest internal conflict was, am I spending my life on the right things? When have you asked yourself that question? Thanks again for listening. And for more information on What Drives Winning, the books, the coaching lab, and the courses that Brett and I teach, visit whatdriveswinning.com. See you next time.